Welcome, iSchool alumni and friends, and a special welcome to those joining us from the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering and the Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering. Thank you for joining us for this second lecture in a four-part series with faculty and researchers from the Center for an Informed Public. Tonight's talk will focus on the upcoming U.S. elections and issues of misinformation, social media, and election security and fairness. I just got a little technical glitch there. So I'm Jevin West. I'm an associate professor in the Information School and one of the co-founders of the Center for an Informed Public. For those who might not be familiar with the CIP, our new center was launched in December of last year with the mission to resist strategic misinformation, promote an informed society, and strengthen democratic discourse. A nonpartisan and interdisciplinary center from across campus, we bring together diverse voices from across industry, government, nonprofits, and other institutions to confront the spread of misinformation and disinformation through our research, education, policy, and community engagement efforts. As we all know, it's been a roller coaster ride since we launched. 2020 has certainly been a year we'll never forget. This field, though, has never been more important. This field of misinformation studies, or whatever it's going to be called in the future. As we find ourselves in the midst of this global pandemic, social and racial justice efforts, and the upcoming election, we need more and more discussions like we're having. And so thanks for joining that discussion. So I'm delighted to have the privilege of introducing my two colleagues today. I'm a huge fan of them. I get to work with them, and they are just amazing thinkers and researchers in the field. So I'll introduce first Kate. So Kate Starbird is an associate professor in the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering and a co-founder of the Center for an Informed Public. Her research is situated within human-computer interaction in the emerging field of crisis informatics, the study of how information communication technologies are used during crisis events. One aspect of her research focuses on how online rumors spread during natural disasters and man-made crisis events. More recently, she has begun to focus on disinformation and other forms of strategic information operations online. In 2018, she received a National Science Foundation Career Award for her research in this area. And for those that know about those career awards, they're very competitive, very hard to get, and it says a lot about her research and her trajectory in this area. The second speaker will be Franzi Rosner, who is an associate professor at the Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering and one of the core faculty members in the CIP. Her research focuses on computer security and privacy. Her interests are broad within that domain, but she is particularly excited about designing and building systems that address security and privacy challenges faced by end users of existing and emerging technologies. You're all in for a treat today because both Kate and Franzi are true leaders, not just at our university, but globally on these issues. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleagues.
All right, and I think I'm going to start. I'm Kate Starbird. I'm associate professor at Human-Centered Design and Engineering, as Jevin said. I'm going to share my screen here, which always takes a second. We hope that I get it right. All right, so I'm going to talk about online disinformation and election 2020. And I'm going to start here, which kind of anchors this conversation a little bit in my research, and just to say that rumors, misinformation, and disinformation are part of the online discourse during crisis events. And I say that because my work has come from the study of social media during crisis events. Examples that we see today, so from fake images of sharks swimming in floodwaters to rumors about Antifa arsonists starting fires down in Oregon, and to conspiracy theories about the origin of the coronavirus, we've all seen these kinds of rumors, false information spreading in online spaces, and we're beginning to see impacts from those. In some ways, COVID-19 is a perfect storm for these kinds of cascades of misinformation. So we have this case where we have persistent uncertainty, and uncertainty is one of the things that stirs the rumor mill. It causes us to want to resolve the uncertainty and try to explain it away. And that sense-making process where we try to explain away the uncertainty that is inherent to a crisis event can make us vulnerable to spreading rumors, and rumors can turn out to be false, and they often do. And so this persistent uncertainty in COVID-19 is making us sort of vulnerable to misinformation, as well as the prolonged and acute impacts of this event. As well, we have this growing distrust in authorities, and in fact, it's been growing even more during the pandemic, as we have gotten mixed messages from different kinds of official sources, and have begun to doubt the things that we're being told. We also have displaced gatekeepers, and where we don't necessarily know where we can go for information we can trust. We have this diverse amount of information we have access to, but it's sometimes hard to find credible sources within that. And on top of all of that, we have sort of a heavy politicized information space. And so right now, we've been experiencing for several months now a kind of an anxiety, a tension, and then just this kind of stirring of the rumor mill. And we've all been, I'm sure, tuned into some of the misinformation that we've been experiencing. At the same time, election 2020 can be a crisis as well. We have unprecedented and dynamic impacts from COVID-19, where we have more mail-in ballots that are going to be used because people are, and the states are trying to accommodate, not bringing people together physically. We have uncertainty that's going to happen due to delays in counting the mail-in ballots. In Washington State, we may be used to that. In other states, they're not used to it, and they're not even used to, their infrastructure isn't yet adapted to counting them quickly. So there's going to take some time to count ballots, and so there's going to be uncertainty. As well, we have political influencers trying to sow distrust in the results. And we're seeing active efforts around that, where they amplify things and try to make it look like we can't trust the election protocols that we're using. And again, we have heavily politicized and polarized information space, where people often are so much getting information only from within their political sphere that we've lost sort of a shared reality or a common ground, and we don't even agree on what the facts are about a lot of things. And so in this case, this is an opportunity for misinformation and disinformation to spread, and we're quite vulnerable right now according to what we understand about crisis events and information spaces. So I want to unpack some of this, but I want to start out with this distinction. I think it's really important. I think people are more and more are beginning to recognize this, but even as a researcher of misinformation, I did not know the definition of disinformation until about 4 years ago. And I've been doing research on online misinformation for about twice that long. So this is something that's actually new. It's new to our discourse, but it's a really important distinction. So misinformation is information that's false, but not necessarily intentionally false. Like a rumor where people are trying to understand maybe how fast COVID-19 is spreading, and they try to predict things and they're getting it wrong, or they might try to understand what the impacts of social distancing will be, and they're trying, but maybe they get the answers wrong. Disinformation, on the other hand, is false or misleading information that's purposefully seeded or spread for a specific objective. For example, a financial, political, or reputational objective. And this difference of intention between misinformation and disinformation, I think, is really important when we think about how do we problematize certain kinds of content, and how we take action to stop the spread of certain kinds of content, both individually and, I think, for the social media platforms themselves. So it's a really important distinction. Disinformation is what I'm going to focus on today. And there's a couple other things about disinformation that are interesting. Disinformation, it's not just purely false, it's misleading often. It's often built around a true or a plausible core, and then it layers factual information with exaggeration or something that misleads, or kind of layers a sandwich of many facts but a couple falsehoods within it. And so it's often hard to pick apart as simply true or false, because the whole package is misleading, even though there are true pieces within it. Disinformation is also not always meant to convince you of something, but sometimes just to confuse you, to create doubt, to foster trust in information systems, and to foster trust in other kinds of democratic institutions, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Disinformation often also works, it's not just one piece of content, it works as a campaign, a series of information actions. It's not just one story about what we'll talk about as later of ballots maybe being mishandled, but it's many different stories that are exaggerated and put within a context to try to tell a particular kind of story that misleads people. And increasingly online disinformation uses inauthentic accounts. It flows through hyper-partisan media outlets and other great propaganda outlets. And increasingly, we're also seeing it come out of the mouths of political leaders and other kinds of influencers in online spaces and online and offline spaces. And so I think it's actually a really critical problem to society right now. I talk about disinformation as a threat to democracy. I think it's really important to understand it as such. And I want to tell a story that begins with our last election in 2016. We were looking at a highly polarized conversation online, and this was actually around the Black Lives Matter movement in 2016, with pro-Black Lives Matter voices trying to draw attention to systemic racism and violence against African Americans by police, and a counter movement of anti-Black Lives Matter conversations. And when we looked at this conversation online, structurally, it was very separated. It was polarized. People on the left were talking to each other, people on the right were talking to each other, but they weren't talking across them very often except to yell at each other, right? So they were structurally separated. And this is like what we talk about as polarization. One of the things we did after we published this paper is we encountered, what happened was Twitter released a list of the Internet Research Agency accounts. So at the time, Russia was actually running operations targeting this very conversation in 2016 as part of their election interference efforts. And what we found when Twitter ended up releasing a list of where those accounts were, who those accounts were, we mapped them into our conversation and found that the Russian efforts had targeted both sides of our political conversation and had infiltrated, had impersonated activists on either side, had become part of those communities, and had begun to spread their propaganda within those communities. And in this case, they were supportive of Donald Trump on the right, and they were trying to discourage people from voting on the left. But they were also echoing other kinds of things, very divisive messages. And we actually can this is an image. It's not a perfect image. I won't say that it totally represents what's going on, but we can think about them as being on the outsides of these two different communities and trying to pull them apart. They didn't create the division in this case, but their disinformation campaign was trying to aggravate that division in our society. So one of the things we've been talking about is that we're vulnerable to spreading disinformation when we engage online with our political identities. And that disinformation is a threat to democracy. And the reason it's a threat to democracy is it pulls us apart, and it pulls at the foundations of like the common ground that we might have. It's trying to disrupt that common ground, to make us distrust each other, to make us distrust information, institutions, elections, and each other, right? So it's trying to undermine our trust in the things that make a democracy strong. So fast forward to election 2020, and I want to talk about what we're seeing right now in terms of disinformation. This time around, what we're seeing isn't foreign interference, and we've been looking for it, and we're not seeing a lot of it. Most of what we're seeing is domestic. In other words, the call is coming from inside the house. A lot of what we're seeing are domestic disinformation campaigns that are using false and misleading narratives to suppress votes and to undermine trust in election results. And I want to give you a couple of examples here. A lot of what we're seeing is around mail-in ballots and the mail-in ballot process, which of course is new in many places because of COVID-19. And so I want to show you a couple of examples. So this example was a tweet sent in early September, a person whose parents lived in California, and they thought that they had received a ballot in California, even though the ballots hadn't been mailed out yet. It's a false tweet. And it turns out that what they received was an information card, but that didn't stop them from posting this. It got thousands and thousands. I think it got 22,000 retweets in about 6 hours, and became part of this idea that you can't trust the mail-in ballots because they're just mailing them out willy-nilly to anyone, even people that didn't live there for 10 years. What was interesting, this could have been an honest mistake, and it very may well have been, except that we know the author works for a political organization, a conservative political organization. So that might have motivated him to share this information, even if he didn't realize that it was wrong. And it becomes part of what we see as a pattern of a disinformation campaign. This is another one that we saw last week. It was a claim that someone had found 1,000 mail-in ballots in a dumpster in California. And again, it's false. It turns out that there were 1,000 ballots, but they were from 2018. They had nothing to do with the 2020 election, and they had been thrown away within the protocol of how they were supposed to be disposed. But someone had found them, taken the picture, and to begin to spread that with a misleading context to suggest it was about 2020, and suggest that we shouldn't be able to trust the results because these ballots are being disposed of in ways that show some sort of fraud. And so we're actually seeing over and over again these same kind of things coming up, and people trying to amplify them and spread them to sow doubt in the election results. And I think this is part of that actual strategy that's being used and to undermine faith in the election results when they happen, especially around mail-in ballots. Here's another one. So this one says that now the Democrats are using mail drop-in boxes, claiming that these are a voter security disaster, and they're going to allow people to vote multiple times. And also, they're not COVID sanitized. So it's actually causing people to maybe think that it won't be safe to use mail-in ballots. This one, Twitter actually put a label on because they decided that it was false, and they wanted people to know that this was false information. And they actually took it they took away the retweet button on it. So this is a false tweet, misleading information that actually may suppress votes, and that functions to sow doubt in the election results. Interestingly enough, this came from President Trump, and it has been a change that Twitter has started to actually take action on these false tweets. But it does show this sort of pattern, both from individual social media users and from elected officials and public and political leaders to continue to spread this kind of misinformation, disinformation. So what we're seeing are networks of activists, social media influencers, and hyper-partisan media outlets are picking up evidence of voting concerns, even when it's there aren't actual evidence. They're framing that evidence in misleading ways and strategically amplifying this content to support meta-narratives that try to undermine trust in the election. And I want to say a couple things about this. I think democracy fails if we lose trust in the process. If we can't trust the results of our elections, then we don't have a democracy anymore. And so it's really important to understand that even those people may be using this to serve a short-term political objective or gain, in the long term, this can actually undermine this whole democratic experiment. Pervasive disinformation erodes the foundations of democratic societies. We don't trust each other, we don't trust information, we don't trust our elections, we can't function. And so again, it's not necessarily the objective of someone to do this when they're using disinformation, but the outcome is that it weakens democracy at its core. And the last thing I want to talk about is just one slide to tell you, just kind of warn you, I've been in some conversations, we've been looking at the mis and disinformation, we're trying to do rapid real-time analysis of some of these different trends. And so I'm going to leave this here. We're likely to experience uncertainty on election night and for some days after, as we wait for mail-in ballots to be counted. And this is something that could very well be true. We might not know the results on election night. That uncertainty will become an opportunity for political operatives, both foreign and domestic, to sow distrust in our election process and results. Democrats are more likely to use mail-in ballots because of the messaging, and Republicans are more likely to vote in person. We actually have survey results now suggesting that's going to happen in many of the states where they can choose. Washington state, maybe not. Other states where they can choose, Democrats are more likely to use mail-in ballots. Because of this, some elections may see a shift in the leading candidate as mail-in ballots are counted, because the earlier ones are going to favor Republicans and later counts will favor Democrats. We are already seeing misleading narratives trying to delegitimize that shift as evidence of fraud. Very specifically, they're trying to undermine mail-in voting in general, so we don't trust it, but also specifically they're trying to say that this shift that happens is going to be evidence of fraud, and don't fall for these narratives. So we can see it developing. We don't know how to otherwise warn people, but we're going to be very vulnerable in those moments after the election when we're waiting for results, and just to be cognizant that people are going to be targeting us for these messages. And I think I'm going to leave the rest of my slides possibly for later as we get other questions, and I'm going to pass this off to Francie.
Sounds good. Thanks, Kate. I'm Francie Rosner. I'm an associate professor in the Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering. I'm going to try to get my screen sharing working. While I do that, just a quick reminder that if you have a question for us, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end, and there should be a link to ask questions at the bottom of your YouTube feed that you're watching. So let's see. I think you should see my slides now. I hope that's working. So I want to share a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing in kind of related contexts. I come at this from a different perspective than Kate. So my background is in computer security and privacy primarily, which is a really broad field where we look at both the technology and the security and privacy features of technologies themselves, but also the ways that people interact with those technologies and what their expectations are and where there might be a gap and so on. So that's kind of the perspective from which I come to this question of mis and disinformation. And one way that I find instructive to think about where we should be focusing our research efforts is to think about it as kind of this very simplified content pipeline of how content is first created, either intentionally as disinformation with the goal to deceive, or maybe unintentionally through rumors or misunderstandings. That content is then posted in various places. It's disseminated, it spreads either through targeted efforts of spreading it or through kind of organic viral spread. It's interesting, lots of people start resharing it. And then ultimately that content is consumed by people who are looking at their computer and smartphone screens and seeing that content and doing something with it. And so there are lots of different places here where we could do something. And so it's the reason I show this is that I think it's useful to think about these various points in terms of how we can understand how mis and disinformation works, what's the role of technology in creating it, in spreading it, and in influencing how people consume it. And so I'll talk about two different points in this pipeline and some of the lessons that we've learned and how those apply to how we should be thinking about how we as people are consuming information leading up to and after the election specifically. So I'll talk a bit about things we've learned about how people interact with potential mis or disinformation on social media. And then I'll talk about a separate topic, but related in the sense of a different view on how misinformation might spread through ads on the web that we might overlook when we're focusing so much on social media. But they'll both give us kind of useful lessons to think about how we consume content ourselves as we are trying to understand what's going on in the world today. So I'll start with talking about how people interact with potential mis or disinformation on social media. This is, of course, a big part of understanding how we can address this problem, because ultimately what is being exploited is the human brain. You and others are consuming lots of information online. A large and increasing fraction of Americans get at least some of their news on social media. And of course, there are lots of complexities in how social media sites end up showing you certain things. And that content might differ from what you might see in kind of a traditional trusted news source that you've sought out explicitly. So a lot of people are getting their news from these places. There's also a lot of mis and disinformation in these spaces. And so we have been interested in trying to understand not just the spread of that information, but once it reaches the consumer, the person who's reading it, how do people think about it? What strategies do they use to try to distinguish what's legitimate, what's not legitimate? And ultimately, how should these systems be designed? What's the potential role, for instance, of the designs of social media platforms, like the label that Kate showed on Twitter, in shaping how people interact with this information? So I'm going to focus on just these first two questions for the sake of time today. I'm happy to dig into the third one in the Q&A. But I want to share a little bit about what we've seen in our research. So we did a study where we actually observed people in person, back when you could do studies with people in person, coming in and scrolling through their own Facebook and Twitter feeds. So they had the context of their actual social networks and so on. And we temporarily, for the purposes of the study, modified their feeds to insert posts that we knew were false. And so we observed how they interacted with those posts. We, of course, clarified afterwards what the true nature of the study had been and what they might have seen. But we wanted to understand, how are people looking at these things? What cues are they using, if any, to decide if something is trustworthy or not, to help us ultimately understand how we might help people along in trying to detect these things in the wild. So this flow chart is a summary of kind of the sets of behaviors that we saw people exhibit as we watch them scroll through their feeds, and you probably recognize these things as things that you do yourself. So when you see a post, there's a set of things you might do. Often people just choose to ignore posts. We're scrolling through our social media feeds very quickly. Some things are really long. They look boring. Sometimes you can tell it's an ad. It's just not relevant, and you don't even really pay attention to it enough to evaluate whether it's true or false. You might be skeptical of it for some reason, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Or you might take it at face value. So for various reasons, you might just believe what it says, even if it turns out to be misinformation. And there's lots of cues you might use for doing that, like you trust the person who posts it. It's your friend who knows a lot about this topic, and you trust what they have to say about it, and you trust that they have vetted the article that they posted. I think it's also important not to feel bad about the cases where certainly I have believed things that I've seen online that turned out not to be true. And it's important to realize that a lot of this, especially intentional disinformation, is designed to really exploit your brain and the biases that you have in your brain, things like confirmation bias, like the fact that we are more likely to believe things that validate worldviews we already hold, and so on. So these are really natural human things that we do that are being taken advantage of by this type of content. So all these types of things might lead us to believe things with more trust than we should otherwise have. One quote from one of our participants that I wanted to point out that I think is a good cautionary tale that I also try to keep in mind is a sense of overconfidence, that because we are aware of the possibility of mis and disinformation, that we will not fall for it. Or that maybe mis and disinformation is a problem for other people, other groups, but not for us. So for instance, one participant talked about how they tended to associate fake news with the political right, and they don't follow anything on the right in their social media feed, so they're not so worried about seeing disinformation. And this can be dangerous because, as Kate pointed out, this type of content and different types of misleading narratives can appear in all sorts of different spaces on the left and the right, and so on. And so just a cautionary tale about overconfidence in our own abilities to evaluate the information that we're seeing. So when we did see people be skeptical of posts, there are various cues that they use for that. Sometimes things just look fake. It seems too good or too bad to be true. The context is weird. We found somewhat surprisingly that people often used a lot of external context to determine whether something made sense. Like, would this person normally post something like this? All these various good cues for taking a second look at something. People then sometimes chose not to investigate it. They might feel skeptical about it, but they weren't necessarily on Facebook to read the news. They just wanted to scroll quickly because they were waiting for the bus. And so they didn't want to put in the time and effort. They weren't that interested in that topic. It's hard to do on a mobile device or in certain contexts. Or we just don't have time. We're inundated with so much content all the time. We can't investigate everything we see. So for instance, one participant, we asked them how long they might spend on a tweet before moving on, and they said, probably less than 8 seconds. And I think that certainly resonates for me personally. Often you're just scrolling through very quickly. And one thing that I personally try to be cautious of is how much the things that I'm seeing influence my worldview, even if I didn't explicitly spend time paying attention to them. Then we get to the case where people actually do actively investigate a post. And there are a variety of strategies, really good strategies, that people used or talked about using in our study. So often it is to go out of the context of social media and look for corroborating evidence for that claim. So evaluate who has posted this, what might their motivations have been in posting it, do they have the credentials that would lead me to believe they would be trustworthy on this topic. Investigating the claims directly, comparing with other sources. People often talked about going to a search engine and doing a search and seeing, what is my trusted news outlet saying about this thing that I saw, and kind of triangulating and doing a little bit of investigation there. This is a lot of work, so it doesn't make sense to do it for every single post, but these can be really effective strategies if you've trained yourself to be a little bit skeptical of things. Of course, there's a balance. We can't be skeptical of everything, then our information ecosystem breaks down as well. Again, a little bit of a caution here from what we saw in our study and more broadly, that we sometimes think that we do this investigation more than we actually do. And we might be very good at being skeptical of posts that don't align with our political views and take at face value posts that do align with our political views. So one lesson here is to try to investigate also your own cognitive biases that might be leading you to not apply your investigations equally. Okay, so I want to spend a few minutes talking about something a little bit different, which is around the role of online ads in spreading mis and disinformation. And the reason that I think this is important is that we spend a lot of time and energy worrying about mis and disinformation that's spread explicitly through websites that we visit on purpose, like social media sites or news websites of various kinds. But actually, a lot of the content that we see when we browse the web is not on those primary pages, but in the ads that are served on those pages. So here, for instance, there's a screenshot of a news site where the top part of the screenshot is actual news content from that site. And the bottom, though it looks very similar, these are actually ads. These are called native ads that look very similar in style to the surrounding content on the page. So if you're not familiar with these, or you're just taking a quick scroll through the page, you might read some of these headlines and not realize that they are actually paid advertising content coming from all sorts of sources, different advertisers who you may not trust with the same level of trust and credibility that you assign to the news site that you're visiting. These ones are actually relatively clearly labeled as sponsored content, but there are lots of examples where it's much more difficult to tell. So one of the questions that we've been investigating is, what is actually the role of these ads in spreading misinformation and disinformation as part of this broader web ecosystem that we're all engaging with? And so if you happen to use an ad blocker, you might not be as familiar with these types of ads. My collaborators and I have looked at a lot of ads intentionally over the last few months. And so we've seen a lot of different types of problematic content in ads, including misinformation and things that are closely related to it. So there are kind of the, you might find ads annoying in general, but there are ads that are legitimately part of the web ecosystem, funding the web and so on, like legitimate ads for products and services, very clear, well-disclosed political campaigns. But we see lots of problematic content in ads, that, especially ads that are hard to distinguish from content of the page that is including the ad. So we see things like content farms, which are, you've probably had this experience where there's an ad for something that sounds like it's going to be really interesting, and you click on it and you're really disappointed that it's just like a slideshow of boring things that are not as exciting as you hoped, and each of those slideshow pages serves you 20 more ads. So just general low quality content. We also see things that start to get a little bit more questionable, like advertorials. So content that looks like an article, like a factual article, but is actually sort of a subtly labeled advertisement for something that's disguised as real content. Similarly, investment pitches start to go even further down maybe the scale of misleading and increasingly harmful content. We also see things that look more like traditional computer security risks, like unwanted software downloads, ads that trick you or mislead you into clicking on a watch button, for instance, that will lead you to download some software that that if you knew exactly everything that it was doing, you might not have chosen to install. And finally, various ads for medical conditions and supplements that are kind of preying on concerns about health and so on, but with this kind of clickbaity style that draws you into clicking on it and then ends up trying to sell you a supplement that maybe does not actually do what it's promised. So one of the reasons that we started looking into this is we wanted to know, is there more misinformation in these ads? Maybe are certain websites worse at showing you bad ads compared to other websites and so on? And I think the bottom line is what we found is that a lot of bad ads contain this type of problematic content. So a lot of the content that people are being served through ads is really misleading and deceptive or otherwise problematic in these various ways. So in fact, we looked at a bunch of news and misinformation sites, and we found that essentially half of the ads that we saw there were problematic in one way or another. So if you're using an ad blocker, this is a part of the web that you maybe are not seeing, but that other people are seeing all the time. We actually didn't find a big difference between bad ads on news versus misinformation sites. We thought that known misinformation sites might have even more misleading ads, but this is actually just the web advertising ecosystem that's appearing everywhere and funding a lot of content on the web. And then to make this a bit more actionable, we found that these ads are not all created equal. The ad ecosystem is extremely complicated. There are a lot of different entities involved in deciding how an ad is designed and who it is served to and where it's placed and so on. And so there are a few key players that are most responsible for serving these types of problematic ads that might be addressable through various policies. So one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this today is that we have started to look at this more recently, specifically in the context of the election. And so I wanted to caution you about some of the types of election-related ads that you might see, some of which are legitimate. So for instance, here is one from Facebook that appeared on a news site in some of our recent measurements that takes you to Facebook's voting information center. So this is a legitimate voting information ad, and we saw others like this trying to get out information about voting registration deadlines and so on. But it also raises concerns about whether these ads can be used for illegitimate purposes. Researchers in previous elections have found, for instance, that ads or other types of content are actually trying to suppress votes or spread false information about voting. We also see ads that are they are fundamentally normal ads, but they're designed in a manipulative way. So we often see, especially political ads that are disguised as polls that lead you into clicking on them in order to express your opinion, and then often get you to, they either send you to a misinformation site or they lead you somewhere to sign up for a mailing list in kind of this very manipulative way. And then finally, we see things that are just much more straightforward mis or disinformation, things that are wrapped up in kind of viral clickbait ads that sound like there's some really juicy information, and the resulting articles are maybe don't quite do justice to what the headline was implying, or are certainly not kind of well-researched news articles, but they appear in these native ad contexts where they look very much like the news headlines on the rest of the page, and so it's very easy to read them and incorporate them into your view of the world without realizing that that was actually an ad that somebody paid for the sake of getting you to click and load more ads and make more ad revenue. For these ads that look like polls or otherwise get you to then sign up for a mailing list, there's actually some interesting research that came out just yesterday from a group of researchers at Princeton, where they looked at what is the content that people get when they sign up for these political mailing lists. And it turns out a huge number of these mailing list emails also contain various types of manipulative content and use similar types of tactics, exploiting your brain again to get you to click and to donate and to read the email and so on. So there's this entire ecosystem of content that is trying to draw you in ways that is kind of exploiting your subconscious biases. So one slide to wrap up, I think, you know, a question now is what can we do today? There are broader questions of what can we do as researchers, what can we do as platform designers? But what can we do today, 1 month from the election, as people who constantly are consuming information online? And just to recap some of those lessons, I think the highest level point, and it sounds maybe trite at this point, but I think it's good to keep in mind to engage with information thoughtfully on social media and on the web in general, and to watch out for those cases where the content is designed to explicitly manipulate you emotionally or exploit those cognitive biases in your brain, and to be aware that even your attempts at trying to detect this type of information can be subject to some of those same biases. So we might be overconfident and miss some of the things that we should be catching. And it's also important to engage kind of kindly and thoughtfully with others. I think I didn't mention it, but one strategy that we saw a lot and that we've seen in other studies as well is that the comments on social media posts can actually be really useful for helping people debunk misinformation. So either comments that people posted or comments that people read, even if they weren't the original poster of the message, can help kind of nip some things in the bud. And then I would caution you to watch out for manipulative content in ads in particular, which is something that you might not have been actively thinking about as you're thinking about trying to avoid misinformation on social media, or on websites. You might forget that actually a lot of the content you see is placed there from other sources from these ads. So I would recommend, having now looked at many of these ads, I would definitely recommend using an ad blocker that comes with some trade-offs. So at a minimum, I recommend being conscious about the content that you're consuming and thinking about who and why and how did it get put in front of you. And then finally, I think a good reminder for all of us, especially as many of us are working from home and looking at screens all the time, it's very hard to put down our devices rather than trying to keep making sense of everything that's going on in the world. And I think that degrades our ability to do this kind of kindly and thoughtfully. So I'll stop there, and we can bring Kate back and see what questions you have for us.
All right, I think the first question here is, given all that you both have covered, what can we do? How do we help counter the flow of misinformation and disinformation and their potential effects on the election? And I think you did a great job with your last slide. I actually skipped my last slide to leave it here because I knew this question was coming, but I guess I can field it to start, and it's going to sound a lot like Franzi's slide because we have very similar things to tell people. One is to slow down when we're engaging in online spaces. Just, the pace of it, when we go very quickly, that's where we can make a lot of mistakes. To tune into our emotions, because a lot of the manipulation, especially the intentional manipulation, is happening not at like sort of the cognitive intellectual level, but it's going through our gut, right? It's manipulating us emotionally to try to activate us to do something like share information or vote or not vote or whatever it is, but that it's trying to get an action out of us, and it does that through emotions. Another thing that we've been thinking about for a long time in our lab is how do we understand and figure out a way to take responsibility. Similar to how we sometimes understand voting, we can often think, I just have one vote, it's not really gonna make a difference. Why am I gonna bother to do that? Well, similarly in the online spaces, if we all kind of say, oh, it's not my responsibility to correct information, or I can't really make a difference, then then the space is actually going to be a mess. But if we kind of can learn to take responsibility in a couple of different dimensions, I think we can actually make it better. And one is to first be open to correction, We all make mistakes. Every single one of us has shared some kind of false rumor, misinformation, or disinformation online in the past. Many of us have probably done it this last week, and I'm pointing at all of you who are sharing things about Donald Trump's diagnosis being a hoax, right? So I saw a lot of that in my feed, and I know that that's happening. So we can't pretend that it's only on the right or it's only on the left. You know, misinformation spreads on both sides. So accept the fact that we do make mistakes, and it happens, and there's good reasons about it, but be open to correction. It's not the worst thing you've ever done, but when you do it, correct yourself. And we can correct ourselves in a lot of different ways. Don't just delete it and hide it, or don't just say, oh, I'm going to leave it up because, you know, I feel like it should have been true even if it's not. But actually go back to that Facebook post and edit it up top and say, hey, folks, this is wrong. Let the people who shared it or reshared it know that it was wrong so they can pull back their posts. And just acknowledge your mistake if you can. And also to learn how to correct others, but with empathy, with this understanding that people make mistakes. How can we correct people in a way that might have an impact on them, but certainly might have an impact on other people seeing that content where it can be really productive to correct. So those are the kinds of recommendations that we've been giving, and they seem to align as well with Francie's recommendations. So I think, yeah, hopefully that can be helpful to some of you.
Yeah, I think that's all really well said, and I think it's almost something that I find hopeful about this space compared to other things that we might think about in computer security, for instance, which is that we are all actually individually pretty empowered to do something here, both for ourselves and for other people. And we can think about, you know, what's the role, for instance, I mentioned that we'd also been thinking about, you know, what's the role of the platform and the platform's designs, like what kinds of notices should Twitter or Facebook or others put up, and those have a role. But what we've seen in some of the other work we've done is that a lot of what's happening is not through those platform interventions, but rather through people correcting each other in the comments or privately, or talking with people offline, or seeking out other sources of information. So I think that is actually empowering, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't want to take the platforms. They need to take responsibility too. I really think this is a really challenging problem, and we need to chip away at it from all different sides. But certainly one of those is to be more resistant or resilient ourselves as users of these platforms. But certainly the platforms should be taking some responsibility, and they are, which leads us to our next question. And I'm going to ask it of you, Francie. What do you both think about Facebook removing political ads on or near the election, or how platforms should handle political content during this time?
Yeah, I thought that's a great question, and I think multiple things. I don't know that I have a perfect answer, and I will say that I agree that platforms have a responsibility that they need to be taken very seriously. I'm also sometimes relieved that I am not the person who has to make the decisions about how exactly they're going to wield that responsibility. I think so I think it's difficult. I think there are some challenges that they're going to face in what they're doing there. So, for instance, at what point do they stop blocking? At what point do they stop blocking those ads? What designates what's a political ad? One thing that we've seen in looking at web ads is that there are a lot of ads that use political content that kind of leverage political activation. They look like polls or something, but they're not actually political ads. They're not coming from candidates. They're not even necessarily about issues. Do those count as political ads? They often don't in the context of these Google and Facebook's political ad transparency programs and so on. So kind of figuring out where to draw that line is really difficult. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't think about where to draw that line. And I think that probably some of this just like stopping of crazy, fast moving information coming out, I think will help. But I don't think it'll be a silver bullet.
And my only comment on the ads about what they've released today, which is that I think I haven't read it closely because I haven't had time to be honest, but that they're talking about removing political ads on either election day or after the election, after the polls close. And I think for Facebook, that has to do a little bit with that scenario I was talking about, where there may be uncertainty about the results and people may be trying to sow distrust in the election results, and that may political advertising may be used to sow that distrust. And I think they're trying to nip that in the bud and not let that happen.
Yeah, so next question is about, we've been talking about kind of short-term, what to expect around this election, but what about long-term impacts and challenges to our political system due to misinformation, and how to think about that? Maybe I'll give that to you, Kate, and then I'll.
Yeah, I mean, we've been experiencing it. Right now, we're talking about the election, but we've been talking about misinformation, disinformation, the pervasive disinformation for a few years now in our lab, and certainly it's been shaping, research directions for other researchers as well. And the long-term impacts are, for a democratic society, are a lost in trust in information. Where I've heard this at the talks I give. People ask, well, where can I go for information I can trust? I can't trust anything, and that's exactly what, it disempowers us. If we can't identify information that we can trust, then we can't know that we have enough information to make decisions about our lives or about our political lives, in terms of thinking about this from the point of it being a threat to democracy, right? So this loss of trust in information is something that could erode our society, and really it can lead to cynicism, or it can lead to actually apathy, and people just, well, I guess they're similar, but to people kind of backing out of the process. So I think that sort of that loss of trust in information, the loss of trust in each other, and the loss of trust in the sort of the institutions and processes that keep us strong as a democratic society. I think that's the risks of disinformation. I do think we can turn the tides. I'm hopeful. I'm not confident that we will, or that it's coming very soon, but I'm hopeful that we can, which is why we're here talking about these things and doing this research, and why the Center for an Informed Public exists, to try to address some of these problems. So hopeful, not confident, but certainly these are some real challenges for society.
Yeah, and I think Kate, what you said earlier about how to engage with each other here is also really important, because it's not just that we want to spot everything that's false in our feeds and then call it out gleefully. I think we want to, we are all trying to make sense. I think COVID-19 has been a good example of all of us trying to deal with something at the same time, and trying to make sense of what's even true and what's the right and safe things to do. And ultimately, we're all trying to, come to some understanding of the world together. And so even as we are urging you to be skeptical of the content that you see, to think about this as like a collective process of trying to understand what's happening.
All right, the next question. I'm worried about deep fake technology. How big of a threat is that, and what can we do about it? Can counter technology be effective?
Yeah, so just in case not everyone is familiar with it, so deepfake technology is basically the ability to create audio or video replicas of people, or photo replicas of people that are extremely realistic. So it could be pictures of people that don't exist at all, or it could be a video of a political candidate giving a speech that he or she never actually gave. So I think that is a big concern. I think it's a concern that's in the broader context of simpler forms of mis and disinformation. I think it's certainly something that we need to be on the lookout for. I think one thing that concerns me a lot there is not even just the ability to do this, to create a fake video of someone using not very much prior information about them. I think the easier it gets, the more we need to worry about that for not just political candidates, but for anybody. I think these are absolutely things we need to worry about. I think we also need to worry about the dual of that, kind of what Kate said, which is that the ability to use that to delegitimize, to make a claim of delegitimacy about anything, which is to say, like, oh, that wasn't a real video, that was a deep fake. And so I don't have a solution to propose, but I think I agree, it raises multiple layers of concerns. I think there's some role of technology in mitigating some of these issues, like deep fake detection or various things that platforms might be able to do. Those can help, but those will not solve the kind of underlying problems of, you don't even need a deep fake to fool somebody. You need just a poorly worded tweet that preys on people's anxieties about something.
Yeah, so currently we're seeing much more of what we call like cheap fakes than deep fakes, and there's cheap fakes are still super effective, and deep fakes are on the horizon, and they're coming. We've seen a few. In terms of what counter technology can do, I think it's going to be a little bit of an arms race, and I do think that the people perpetrating it may always have a head start, and the folks trying to defend against it are going to be running a little bit behind. And it's going to be a real task for both the platforms to figure out how to take action and prevent the spread, and also for us as consumers of information to become savvy about it, so we cannot be fooled, but also not too overly skeptical that we trust nothing, right? So it's a double-edged sword, right? Like it can cause a false belief in the moment, but in the long term it can cause us to believe nothing, which in some ways is just as problematic. So yeah, I think this is going to be a real task for the platforms as this comes from the horizon into the foreground and becomes more of an active problem, where right now it's something of a predicted problem that's not quite here yet, even though we've seen a little bit of it here and there. Kate mentioned that you're seeing less foreign disinformation efforts in this election versus the last. To what do you attribute that? Why would that be? I can't say I can't make strong claims here as a researcher, because we don't know why we're not seeing as much. Part of it may be that we're misattributing, but I don't think that's true. A lot of the disinformation we're seeing right now is coming through known individuals that are U.S. citizens. So I do think that platforms were totally not ready in 2016, and these campaigns had been running since 2014, and they had already kind of integrated into some of these communities, and so in 2016 we were hit unaware, and then the platforms have been doing a much better job in the last few years of identifying foreign disinformation campaigns, and so I think they've just been a little bit more effective in keeping those off the platform, or keeping them from having a lot of impact on the platform. And perhaps there's something about the strategies that are going on that may be that we're either not seeing or it's just not as salient. So I think a little bit of what the platform's actions that they've been taking, and possibly some of a change in strategy by those actors. But unfortunately, assessing those strategies is often going to be an after the fact kind of thing.
Yes. The next question is asking about the balance between free speech and disinformation, or between disinformation and regulation. I think this is also a really tricky question. Of course, if it were simple, we would already have an answer and we wouldn't be dealing with these things. And maybe to elaborate on the reason why it's tricky is that it's hard to, maybe going back to kind of the COVID-19 context example, where we're all trying to make sense of this very complex thing that has been happening, there is inevitably information that is not correct. And even experts who we trust will change their opinions over time. And so it's kind of fundamentally hard to draw a line and say, here is what is true and here is what is not true. And therefore some entity should say, here's what we can say and here's what we shouldn't say. And so I think we do hold strong values around free speech and making mistakes and exploring different narratives. Sometimes narratives differ not intentionally, but because of kind of different ideological perspectives that are hard to say, whether something is true or false. So again, I don't envy the platform designers or regulators who have to make choices about where to draw lines, but it still doesn't mean there's nowhere we should draw the line. And so inevitably, I think it's impossible to find a place where you can draw the line where everyone will agree it's the right place to draw the line. And so that's always a little bit of a negotiation. And for some things, it may be very clear, and for some things, it may not be clear. I don't have the right solution. I think that's a balance we will have to keep exploring.
Yeah, I mean, this is the question. If it was so easy of just, being able to say, oh, that's false, let's take it off the platform. It's just, the platforms would be able to fix this problem right away. But we do have this thing this value of freedom of speech and there's legal implications, but there's also this value that we have. And I think all of us really think that, diverse ideas, the ability to push back against government voices that may be telling us the right thing or the wrong thing, the ability to share different perspectives, I think is really important, and it's part of the fabric of who we are. And that's not something that we want to lose. At the same time, what we're seeing, it's not about just a piece of content. It's these campaigns, often using inauthentic actors, gaming systems to manipulate the reach, to spread content in ways that is often manipulative, and if the people experiencing it understood how it was manipulating them, they might be able to take different action. But because of the way the system is designed, they can't see that manipulation. And that's not about, sharing ideas. That's about gaming systems. And so I think when we think about disinformation as a campaign and think about how it's manipulating through gaming the systems, that kind of gives us an opportunity to act, not based on the content of necessarily of the information, but based on the efforts to manipulate people by sharing this kind of information in certain kinds of ways. And so but it's tricky. I totally agree. It's a tricky question. And that's why we're sitting here today and having these conversations, because if it was easy, it would be solved.
And maybe one thing I'd add is that we do draw the line in various places on speech. There are certain regulations around things like around advertising, for instance, around deceptive advertising, or scams or other things. So there are places where we do agree to draw lines. And I think one of the tough things here is the ecosystem is extremely complicated and nuanced, and it's not straightforward where we could agree to draw lines that we could express in a simple way that are not kind of situation by situation.
All right, with that, it's time to wrap up. And I'm going to read this text that has been given to me to read. Thank you all for tuning in, especially those iSchool alumni and those from the Human Centered Design and Engineering Department and the Allen School. The next in this series of CIP lectures is coming up on Wednesday, November 17. It will feature Ryan Kalo and Mary Fan from the UW School of Law, who will discuss how law and policy can be important tools in addressing misinformation and disinformation, with a special focusing on privacy and technology.
So maybe that last question we started talking about regulation will be a good question to ask again at that next event. So a recording of this will be posted online. And thank you all again so much for tuning in and for your really excellent questions. Have a great